Some of you might have seen here in Skokie uh, flags coming from cars driven by Jewish people that have a crown, a blue crown on a sort of golden background, a yellow gold background, and words in Hebrew. Those words are Melech Mashiach, and which means in Hebrew Christ the King. It's the Lubavitchers who, the half of the Lubavitchers who believe the Rebbe Schneerson was the Messiah, but it doesn't say that on the banner. Every time I see one go by, and I don't see them as much as I used to, Melech Mashiach, I think Christ the King. Well, I can salute that. This is a great feast, and it's a relatively recent feast. I think people don't realize that. It's a feast that began in the 20th century. It is not of great antiquity, which does not diminish its importance. It was a feast that was established in solidarity with the suffering Mexican Catholic Church. The Catholic Church in Mexico from 1917 on was widely persecuted, so much so that in the later 1920s, in the middle of the 1920s, it burst out in violent revolution. And people who resisted the government, whether violently or non-violently, were called cristeros, or I suppose in English, Christers. It doesn't make any sense in English, but cristeros. And we don't know about that period. And there is some talk of complicity, even on the part of our own government in the suppression of Catholicism. I don't know. I'd have to research that further, but it certainly is true that Mass was in many places in Mexico essentially prohibited. In one of the states of Mexico, one priest was allowed to serve the entire Catholic population of the entire state. And the penalties for resistance were death. There were some cristeros who asked the little boy to hold their horses. And the little boy, knowing who they were, held their horses. And they left, jumped on their horses, and the police were hot on their trail. And the police took that little boy. He was, I think, just a child. I think he was not even 10 years of age. And they made him dig his own grave, and with his mother watching, they shot him. And his mother, as she watched her child dig her own grave, she encouraged him not to give up the faith and to die nobly as a soldier of Christ. And the little boy, I believe, if I remember the story correctly, held out his arms, and as they all did, said, "Viva Cristo Rey," long live Christ the King, as he was shot. We hear of the great Father Miguel Pro doing the same. The government executed him for daring to be a priest who said Mass publicly in Mexico, and he was constantly on the run from the government. They wanted to photograph his execution so that people could see him cringing and cowering, but at the moment that the cameras snapped, he too put out his arms and said, "Viva Cristo Rey," and that picture is very common in many Mexican households. Now, the story of the little boy, I didn't read in the history book. I was told that by Deacon Miguel Valle, who was the deacon at St. Genevieve's Parish, because you see, his godfather was a priest whose best friend this little boy had been when he was a child himself, and inspired by the sacrifice of that martyr, he became a priest and went on to be the godfather for the Reverend Deacon Miguel Valle, who was a very godly man. These things happened on our borders and within the living memory of many people, and they are forgotten by us. And this feast day was established to acknowledge what the Mexican people acknowledged with their life's blood, that no matter what the government, and no matter how opposed the government is to the truth of the Catholic faith, we will have no king but Christ. Now, last week in the Gospel, we had the story of the talents. And a lot of people don't understand that parable because it seems to end very badly. I mean, the master takes from one servant, he takes the talent of gold or silver, I think it was a golden talent, and gives it to the one with the most, and then throws the lazy servant out, and it seems unfair. The word that is usually translated servant is not servant. The word is slave. And in the ancient world, there are a number of kinds of slavery. Most slaves were debt slaves. There were political slaves, and there were slaves captured in war. And those fates were truly horrible. But most slaves were debt slaves, especially in the Middle East. That if a person went into debt, he would be sold for his debts, and it was as if a social contract. He was working off his debt. And then there were actually people who voluntarily sold themselves into slavery. It would be common for a well-educated Greek to sell himself into slavery because he could be very well educated in some poor little town in Greece and starve to death. But if he was attached to a wealthy Roman household as the tutor of children, he would live well, and with tips and bonuses, he could buy his freedom and retire prosperously in his old age. So slavery was not quite what we assume. It wasn't the horrific racial slavery that we experienced in this country. There were a number of kinds of slaveries. But the word is slavery, so that's important to understand. The word talent is a measure. It isn't an amount of money. It is a measure, a weight. And in today's money, a golden talent comes to just under $1 million. So this master calls in his slaves. To one he gives $4.5 million. To one he gives $1.8 million. To the other he gives about $8.5 million. Can you imagine giving millions of dollars to a slave as you're leaving town? Well, he comes back and he says, "Where's my money?" Of course, one presents more, the second presents more, and the third presents the 8.5 or whatever it was $1 million. And he says, "I knew you were a hard man." So the master takes from that slave the almost $1 million that he'd given him and gave it to the one who had done a good job. Well, think about it. The money was not the property in the first place of the slave. The slave himself was the master's property. He took nothing that belonged to that slave. And that slave had not lived up to the deal. He had not served his master well, who had in effect paid his debt. You know what the slave's punishment was? He was given his freedom. Remember the parable from last week? He was put out where there was weeping and gnashing of teeth. He was put out of the household. He was given his freedom and allowed to fend for himself. The master, in effect, said, "Because you do not want me to take care of you, I will no longer take care of you." When Jesus was brought up before Pilate, the assembled mob said, "We have no king but Caesar." And it was not many years after that that Jerusalem was destroyed.